I want to thank you both for being with us. As we wrap up now with the death of Aimé Césaire, the esteemed poet, writer, politician, and anti-colonial activist from Martinique, who died last Thursday at 94 years old. He is revered in the Francophone world as a leading figure in the movement of black consciousness and pride, which he called negritude. Césaire was also a politician for a large part of his life. The Caribbean island of Martinique is administratively and politically a region of France, and its residents are French citizens. Césaire served as the mayor of Martinique's capital and the elected representative to the French Constituent Assembly for close to half a century. French President Nicolas Sarkozy led thousands of mourners at an official state funeral Sunday for Césaire in Martinique. But in 2005, Césaire had refused to meet Sarkozy because of a new law Sarkozy had proposed emphasizing the positive legacy of French colonialism. Césaire's use of culture to fight colonialism and racism influenced generations of activists and writers around the world. Fellow Martinican author and revolutionary Frantz Fanon considered Césaire to be his mentor. Today we'll speak with Professor Robin Kelly about the life and legacy of Aimé Césaire. Kelly is Professor of American Studies and Ethnicity at the University of Southern California and the author of several books, including Freedom Dreams, The Black Radical Imagination. He also wrote the introduction to a new edition of Césaire's famous 1955 essay called Discourse on Colonialism. Professor Kelly joins us now from our Firehouse studio in New York. Welcome to Democracy Now!, Professor Kelly.
Oh, thank you, Amy.
Tell us who Aimé Césaire was.
Well, Césaire, among other things, was probably one of the greatest poets of the 20th century. He was an activist, revolutionary, who really demolished the maxim that poets make bad politicians. He's someone who, throughout his life, of course, you mentioned he was one of the founders, if not the founder, of the negritude movement, beginning in 1935 when he wrote an essay coining that phrase. On the one hand, negritude for him was a recognition that Africa had value, and he'd been reading Leo Frobenius's book, History of African Civilization. But for him, you know, Africa having value and celebrating black pride wasn't enough. He had a forward-looking vision, a post-colonial vision. And when he returned to Martinique with his wife, Suzanne Césaire, who's one of the greatest intellectuals of that era as well, they edited a journal called Tropique, which was a truly anti-colonial manifesto in some ways that combined surrealism, Pan-Africanism, and Marxism to pretty much propose a very modernist vision of society that would transcend Europe. And you remember what happened after the end of World War II. You know, Europe was in shambles philosophically, politically, and it was Césaire, when he wrote Discourse on Colonialism, that kind of made the argument that, you know, the brutality and barbarism that defined colonialism came back to roost in some ways and can explain fascism in Europe.
Une civilisation qui s'avère incapable de résoudre les problèmes que suscite son fonctionnement est une civilisation décadente. Une civilisation qui choisit de fermer les yeux à ses problèmes les plus cruciaux est une civilisation atteinte. Une civilisation qui ruse avec ses principes est une civilisation moribonde.
And then one fine day, the bourgeoisie is awakened by a terrific boomerang effect. The Gestapos are busy. The prisons fill up. The torturers standing around the racks invent, refine, discuss. People are surprised. They become indignant. They say, "How strange, but never mind. It's Nazism. It will pass." It is Nazism, yes, but that before they were its victims, they were its accomplices. That they tolerated that Nazism before it was inflicted on them, that they absolved it, shut their eyes to it, legitimized it, because until then, it had been applied only to non-European peoples.
When was the Overlook built?
Construction started in 1907. It's finished in 1909. The site is supposed to be located on an Indian burial ground, and I believe they actually had to repel a few Indian attacks as they were building it.
And if any group of people have the wherewithal or vision to recreate modern society, it is colonial peoples.
One of the things that we are concerned about is some of the problems in the left and what is called, and I put quotes, the resistance. I think this conference, this forum, is called The Resistance. And clearly, and I'm certain many of you would kind of agree with this, how do we distinguish the left from the liberals and neoliberals? How is the left not the same as the corporate Democrats and really the deep state? We see this convergence, and the left, and I would say pretty much the white left, has not been able to come forward with a consistent analysis appropriate to this moment in the history of world capitalism. I would say just to begin, that Trump's election was not an event. It was the result of processes, and I think we can see it more clearly now, processes that perhaps go back to the Great Recession of 2007, 2009. The greatest downturn in the economies of global capitalism since the Great Depression. And in a lot of ways, the political crisis, which, you know, in interviews with Glenn, I usually refer to a crisis of legitimacy. That is to say, the old forms of governing and ruling the people are no longer acceptable to perhaps the majority of the people. Now, that is not to say that everyone has come to that conclusion from the same place politically. But I think it is beyond question that we are in a crisis of legitimacy. All of the major institutions of governing and ruling the people are being rejected by the people. And so when you combine the crisis of neoliberal capitalism with the crisis of legitimacy, that is the people accepting the rule and governance of the governing class, it begins to make more sense than the narrative, which is clearly the narrative of the corporate media, that on November 8th, we got the worst president in the history of the United States, who, along with all of his reactionary views, and I want to say parenthetically, all of his views are not reactionary. Along with that, he is an idiot.
You're giving idiots a bad name.
Yes, yeah, maybe I'm giving idiots a bad name. But this narrative, which has pretty much been embraced by most of the left, is without any kind, I think, of understanding of a world beyond the politics of the United States and pretty much beyond bourgeois politics, electoral politics, Democrat and Republican politics. Now, and this comes from very sophisticated people. Need I mention Noam Chomsky? Need I mention Democracy Now? Need I mention most of the most recognizable left and progressive thinkers? So I begin there. A crisis that did not begin on November 8th. A crisis that had been brewing for some time. More than that, this is more than just an American phenomenon. Well, Brexit preceded our elections. But what about the rejection of constitutional change in Italy? What about the vote called for by Syriza in 2015, where the people voted to leave the EU? What about the political instability all across continental Europe? So this is not just an American affair. It is a crisis of legitimacy in the major centers of global capitalism.
Goddamn soul. Just a glass of beer. Hi, Lloyd. A little slow tonight, isn't it?
Yes, it is, Mr. Torrance. What'll it be?
White man's burden, Lloyd, my man. White man's burden.
See, I don't think that the fascists have to run for office or have to stage a coup d'etat to take power. The fascists are already embedded in the state. What do you call a John Negroponte? How do you politically define a Samantha Powers or a Gloria Nuland or a Susan Rice? I mean, you know, we could name them. They don't have to run for office. And as you mentioned, and this is very interesting, coming to the end of a 70-some-year era of the, and I put quotes again, the American century. That is the world constructed institutionally and politically and militarily by Americans and representatives of the American ruling class and political class.
This conjunction of an immense military establishment and a large arms industry is new in the American experience. The total influence, economic, political, even spiritual, is felt in every city, every state house, every office of the federal government. We recognize the imperative need for this development, yet we must not fail to comprehend its grave implications. Our toil, resources, and livelihood are all involved. So is the very structure of our society. In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex.
And as a part of that, a principal institution of this new American century is the American presidency. It is an institution of the, quote, American century. And by that, you know, that concept should be understood as a concept hatched by hegemonists. It's not a century of democracy. It is a century of the struggle to achieve complete hegemony over the people of the planet and its resources. And the American presidency, even more than the IMF or the EU or NATO, is the principal instrumentality of war. But if that is the case, then we have to understand what fascism is and is not. Our situation is not Germany of 1930, where fascism swept from outside and took power. The fascists have gradually taken power over these past 7 decades.
I don't have any nightmares about brown shirts. Our brown shirts wear blue. And we have tens of hundreds of thousands of them. We have a black mass incarceration state whose beginnings can be traced to the last days of the Johnson administration with the passage of the bill that authorized the Law Enforcement Assistance Administration, whose duty was to basically federalize the funding and direction of local police, paving the way for mass black incarceration.
In its original articulation, the Nazi campaign of Eastern expansion, Lebensraum, was called a German version of the Monroe Doctrine, while Dr. James Whitman writes in Hitler's American Model, The United States and the Making of Nazi Race Law, that the Nuremberg race laws were informed by the example of genocidal American Indian laws. The German occupation governor of Poland, Hans Frank, even described Jews of Ukraine as Indians in 1942.